Hello, it is my absolute pleasure to join you today to talk a little bit about what the past and the history of science communication and the challenges that we're facing today, how those two together can help us decide what we as science communicators are going to need to do in the future. As an academic discipline, science communication is probably only about 40 years old, but the practice of science communication has gone on for hundreds, if not thousands of years before that. So many of the popular histories of science communication as a discipline have traced its origins back to times like the 1600s, when the Royal Society in the United Kingdom first started, when we had public lectures from the likes of Michael Faraday demonstrating scientific phenomena to audiences. In Brazil in the 1800s, that saw the production and the beginnings of magazines that were dedicated to providing articles talking about issues relating to science and technology and describing science and technology to their readers. There are some historians who argue that the origin of science communication could actually be traced back to the popularization of knowledge, which was observed in the Greco-Roman times. Others argue again that really science communication as a practice can go back many thousands of years before then. If we look at, for example, the first Australians, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, they have a continuous cultural history spanning 65,000 years. And in all of that time, they have observed the night sky. They've used it for navigation. They have observed plants and animals, how water moves, and used that knowledge to care for country, a fundamental practice to nurture and support the environment. Now, their ancient knowledge was passed from generation to generation and still is today. And we're recognizing the benefits of this long-standing culturally embedded history of understanding the planet and how it works as we start to grapple with some very serious environmental issues in Australia, particularly around things like preparing for bushfires. So the Indigenous practices of cool fire burning to minimise the severity and the threat of bushfires is something that is being actively implemented into our broader national land management strategies. So there is obviously a very old tradition within Australia of scientific knowledge being communicated and shared. Now, this extends absolutely to other places around the world as well. If we look to China, so in the 1000s, the Brush Talks from Dreambrook was a collection of stories collected by the author from his conversations with other people. So really supporting that notion of grassroots science, getting people's stories and then writing them in a way that was easy to understand and interesting to a non-specialist audience. And over half of the book's content focuses on issues relating to science and technology, things like astronomy, geography, and medicine. And it was really about taking these sometimes complex topics and ideas and making them accessible, interesting, and relevant for a non-specialist audience. All core concepts and ideas of science communication, which we practice today. Within the last 3 years in particular, science communication has been in the spotlight like never before. When I first started as a science communicator, when people asked what I did, they'd say, "Oh, what's that?" Now I don't get the what's that question as much, but what I do hear a lot more of is, "Oh, that's really important. We need more of that." And it's true, because around the world, as a global community, we are grappling with issues and problems that have a basis in either the cause or the solution in science. Things like natural disasters and COVID. Everybody has a vested interest in science, whether they realize it or not. But in order to make people understand, to change their behavior, to accept information, that relies on them being able to understand the processes, how to verify information, and how to actually engage with science in the first place. So the topic of this conference is very much related to the idea of science literacy, and I'd like to explore that with you a little, with a particular focus on media, where a lot of my work over the past 10 years has been focused, the relationships between science, scientists, our science communicators, and the media. If we talk about public engagement from a media perspective, there are so many different ways and channels that people can actually access scientific information now. So we do have our traditional media, which are things like newspapers, radio stations, magazines, television. Then we have digital media, and these are media outlets which were born and survive on the internet. We have owned media, so information that comes from places like universities and research institutions. And then, of course, social media, which allows users to generate their own content or to share content from other platforms within and between their social networks. So in many ways, our audiences have access to more information than they have ever had before. But with that comes some challenges, because how do they separate fact from fiction? How do they understand what is a trustworthy source, particularly when everything seems to be presented in a way that draws on evidence? How can we get people to understand what is real and relevant to them? And that's going to change from place to place and person to person. This is not a new challenge. And it's something that researchers have been looking at for some time. So in the UK, in 2001, when talking to scientists, the Wellcome Trust found that about a third blame the media as being a barrier to public understanding. So they think that the media is really getting in the way of people truly understanding what's going on. But almost half do see the media as the most effective means of communication. In 2008, one of the reasons for scientists to talk about their work to the public was to create a better educated public. So we started to get this sense of scientists wanting general audiences to understand their work and why it's important and why they do what they do. A later study, again, this time in America, is looking at how Americans see and understand scientific research. Almost half saw problems with how scientific research issues are communicated, and about 3/4 of them blame the media for that, and only 1/4 blame the scientists. But this does set up an interesting idea. It is the media's job to report factual information in a way that is engaging and relevant to their readers. But you can't have journalists being experts in every single scientific discipline. Not even a scientist is an expert in every single scientific discipline. So I would argue that the responsibility for making sure that the scientific information is easy to understand should actually sit with the scientists themselves. I had a look at the relationship between scientists, science communicators, and journalists in Australia with some students a few years ago. And we conducted interviews with people from all over the country, from all three groups. Now, it did vary from publication to publication, so the quality of the relationship and the quality of the news that was reported. But overall, the relationships were generally positive. The interesting thing is the science journalists are almost an endangered breed, I guess, in Australia. But we do have quite a few working as freelancers, and many of them have scientific qualifications. So they've become science journalists as part of a career change, or they've pursued scientific qualifications to help them better write about science news. So our science journalists in Australia, the majority of them do understand the process of science and how it works, and they understand how media works. Talking to the scientists, however, the majority of them argued that journalists really need to know more about science. They're very much pushing for the responsibility for the effective communication of science onto the journalists. Our journalists already know about science, and they already know about media. Perhaps this cultural divide, scientists should be willing to actually understand a little bit more about how media works themselves as well. There are some that do and who do it very well, but this perception that the responsibility is solely the journalists could be starting to create some problems and can contribute to why there is this perception that science isn't necessarily communicated clearly or well. It's a shared responsibility, but scientists really do need to own their part of it. Going back to an earlier study now, back in America, 85% of surveyed scientists felt that the public doesn't know very much about science. And this is getting to what they perceive as a major problem. And we saw elements of that in the previous studies, where scientists wanted to talk to people to make a better educated public. So throughout all of the literature, this concept of scientific illiteracy, people not understanding science, was the root of opposition to any new technologies, environmental action, and adequate science funding. Now, this is very much getting to the deficit model. If we just tell people more information, if they understood it, then they would accept it. But we know that this isn't the case. So let's have a bit more of a look at science literacy and the components that go into it to determine where things could be going wrong and how, as current and future science communicators, we may be able to start to address these issues. So scientific literacy has been defined as familiarity with the enterprise and practice of science. The program of international student assessments at PISA, which is a global study administered to 15-year-olds around the world, testing their ability to understand science and maths and their literacy levels. The PISA study defines scientific literacy as the ability to engage with science-related issues and with the ideas of science as a reflective citizen. And so they're tested on their ability to understand and explain scientific concepts and ideas, to evaluate and design experiments or tests to test scientific ideas or hypotheses, and how to interpret results to make conclusions. And they're also tested on their ability to apply scientific knowledge in the context of real life situations. Again, COVID and climate change in particular are constant reminders of how we need to apply scientific knowledge in the real world, right here and now, either to protect ourselves and loved ones or to try and formulate ways of living to protect our natural resources. Now, Howell and Brossard have proposed a model of science literacy, and they're drawing on three main factors, which they argue all work together to create science literacy. And so let's go through these one by one. So the first is science production. And at its core, this is looking at things like the process of science. How do we generate scientific knowledge? The institutions that create this scientific knowledge, what are they working towards? What are their norms? What are their goals? And then how does this relate to society? And so this is very much the civic scientific literacy is looking at this relationship between science and people. That fundamental understanding required of people to know how science works. So understanding the process of science is very important. Science is built on incremental knowledge. We need results that we reproduce the studies and we can replicate the results. And that is cumulatively building the body of evidence that our understanding is correct. But even when we're talking about our science, we're still presenting our best understanding at that time. If you are familiar with how science works, you're always aware that there is the possibility that some new bit of information will come to light and our understanding might change. If we look at the way that we talk about our science as well, there will always be different interpretations and different ideas about the same thing. For example, the concept of light. It's been described as a ray or a wave or a particle, and all of these are correct and incorrect at the same time. If you aren't familiar with the process of science, this can be confusing, and it becomes worse when you have public disagreements between scientists. But this uncertainty and disagreement between scientists is also the process for moving things forward. And again, it's not new. So if we go back to the 1000s, we have Ibn Sina, who's the father of modern medicine, a philosopher who drew a lot on Aristotle's way of thinking and used that to develop methods to test and refine knowledge and ideas. And one of the ideas that he put forward was that the universe was created from existing matter. Now, around the same time, slightly later, another philosopher, Al-Ghazali, who also contributed a lot to Islam and philosophy and education and the pursuit and practice of education, had a different school of thought and used that to put forward the proposition that the universe was in fact created from nothing. And so here we have two respected philosophers, two respected thinkers, both proposing competing ideas. So this whole idea of experts disagreeing is not new, and if anything, it's become more pronounced as we have progressed through time. We're also starting to see a lot more disagreement in public fora as well. For example, the School Strike for Climate movement is seeing youth around the world mobilise to ask political leaders and adults to do better and to do more about climate change. However, we also have information that's being perpetrated through different sources that isn't correct. And so you have people who are getting information that hasn't been through the full scientific process, that hasn't had that checking of facts and the rigor and quality of the experiments, making incorrect claims, which are then put forward through people's blogs, for example. And so we have these competing information sources which may or may not be given more credence or validity than the other, but they're also not dealing with the same things. Sharing non-peer-reviewed information is immediately, for someone familiar with the process of science, this is tentative, it's untested, and it's not necessarily factual. But if it's presented as factual, that can create the wrong idea and the wrong understanding. And this gets to the second factor within the science literacy model, which is that of digital media science literacy. So digital media science literacy is kind of blending the digital literacy together with the media literacy. And this is very much about looking at how people can use technology to engage with everyday activities in society, but also whether or not they understand the processes of media production. So just as there is a process for generating scientific information, there is also a process within media for how that information gets presented to different audiences. One of the ways this is done is through things like framing. So here we have two newspapers, both talking about the current COVID situation, but both taking a very, very different stance. So the Daily Mail has used a headline which is negatively framed and frankly would probably inspire panic more than anything else. And it's very much about creating this shocking headline, which is designed to capture attention, but the impact on the reader is one likely of helplessness and fear. Compare this to the Irish Daily Mail, which is positively framed, and together we can save many lives. And so this is saying to the reader, there is something that we can all do together to try and change the outcome. We're all in danger, but there is something that we can do about it. And the role of framing can be incredibly powerful in shaping public perceptions and therefore their response to scientific issues. Within Australia, for example, the Murdoch newspapers for many years were proponents of climate change denial. They certainly went out of their way to downplay or downright refute any climate science, including taking claims like the planet is warming and climate change is going to create catastrophic conditions to, well, maybe warming is possibly good for us. There's other science which says this is okay. But it's like taking 999 opinions and giving it equal weight to one and presenting the two sides as equal and claiming balance is not correct. So these kinds of headlines and this kind of media coverage has created a very politicized situation, which has, in Australia at least, has stymied and prevented a lot of meaningful action towards mitigating the impacts of climate change. Misinformation also plays a part in this. So in our summer of 2019 and 2020, we had catastrophic bushfires. Many were caused by lightning strikes, but they were so severe and so catastrophic simply because of the dry conditions and the conditions that had been created by human-driven climate change. A study looking at the social media discussions, however, found that there was a hashtag called Arson Emergency, which had over 300 accounts active within it using this hashtag. And anything that did use this hashtag was starting to put forward this misinformation, as shown in this tweet. And it's using appeals of expertise, so authorities in Australia, but they're not saying which ones. And the media and celebrities continue to blame climate change. And so putting those quotation marks there is immediately implying, well, climate change isn't a thing. So the researchers that looked at this had identified about 100 bots. So these are little computer programs, not even real people, that were just generating more and more of these tweets and pushing out this misinformation. In actuality, only 24 people around the country were arrested for arson in this time. And yes, there are arsonists, and yes, some of them did light fires, but much fewer than 24. And there was absolutely no doubt that the cause of the destructive nature of the fire, the scale and the scope of them, was solely attributable to climate change. However, this contributes to sowing seeds of doubt. And this doubt exists around the world. So there's a global study called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which speaks to representative samples of populations from 27 different countries around the world. And the questions relate to who people trust and what they're worried about in the way that society is operating. This year, the concerns about fake news or false information being used as a weapon are at an all-time high, with over 3/4 of the global population sampled convinced that this is really a thing that's happening in their country and it's a big problem. And so this gets back to this idea of knowing how to validate and verify information, identify trustworthy sources, as well as understanding how the process of science works. So both of these factors in combination are important, but there's one final one that we need to look at, which is the cognitive science literacy. So when you're faced with all of this uncertainty, when you're faced with all of this information, at the end of the day, an individual also has to make a decision for themselves. And our decisions are very much framed by our beliefs, our values, the way that we approach thinking and problem solving. Also our motivations for trying to understand this information and our own emotions. And an emotional response to things, our outrage, can be created by fear or simply not understanding something or having a very real objection to something related to the scientific topic, but not necessarily the science itself. And so these emotional responses are also starting to play out in countries around the world as people react to things like vaccine mandates, like actions for climate change. And all of these things together combine to create this sense of opposition and overall distrust. So when we talk about creating a scientifically literate community, we need to speak to, yes, how science works, but also how media works. And then remember that there is a person involved in this as well, each with their own interpretation, understanding, and individual context, which they are going to be using to try and evaluate the science and the media information that they get. So it is a challenge. And how do we start to manage this? Going back to the Edelman Trust Barometer, each year people are asked about who they trust. And now there is a potential role for science communication as being a trusted broker of information. And if we look at these global results over the last 10 years, we can find that an academic expert, for example, is quite often the most trusted source. So they have that expertise, they have that background knowledge, and they are the person who is best equipped to communicate that information. Now, if we think back to those earlier studies I talked about where the relationships between scientists and journalists can be a little bit fractious, have a look at this. Down the bottom of the graph, one of the least trusted sources for information are journalists. But if one of the most trusted sources is an academic expert and their main way of getting information to a public audience is through one of the least trusted sources, how do we manage that? Where do we go from here? The other thing to look at is the second most trusted source. And again, this has been consistent in this graph for the last 10 years and for as long as this study has been running. Aside from an academic expert, in the absence of one of those, the person that we're also most likely to trust is someone just like ourselves, someone who comes from the same kind of background, from the same values and beliefs, who has that same outlook on life as us. So as science communicators, we can use that human element to create that connection between people and help to build bridges of trust. And it has been done before. So the historian's overview, and this is going back from the Greco-Roman times, the author concluded that trust or mistrust in science has always been a part of the process, and that scientific knowledge and its popularization has always been part of the respective societies that existed within. So around the world, within every culture, there have been issues of trust and mistrust, and also that desire to share knowledge and to understand. So if this has been going on for hundreds and thousands of years, how can we use this now? Some places we already are. So in Africa, there have been continual and repeated outbreaks of Ebola. And in West Africa in 2014 to 2016, this was probably one of the largest and most complicated outbreaks. Ebola is spread through contact with infected animals or humans, and a lot of the traditional cultural practices of say traditional burial were also facilitating the spread of the disease. Now, within West African culture, there were traveling musicians or musicians that lived within communities called griots. And griots were responsible for sharing information, for communicating messages to communities, for sharing history and tradition and culture. And they were very respected members of the community. During the Ebola crisis, there was a lot of mistrust about the official health information coming from government sources or from emergency response type sources. So modern day griots, rappers from Liberia, in this example I'm showing here, created a song that gave information about Ebola and how to minimize the spread. And their music video also showed demonstrations of, or examples of, how you can minimize the spread while still doing the things which are important to you in your daily life. So here we've taken an ancient tradition of musicians being a trusted channel for information, which hundreds of years later has been replicated using the modern form of rap to, again, communicate information to audiences which they mightn't trust from a more official source, but coming through music, that made it more acceptable. So there are things that we can learn from our cultural heritage within our respective nations, which we can use for our communication of science today. Going back to Brush Talks from Dreambrook, the review of this book from a modern perspective found that scientific and technical communication in history as well as today should be democratic as well as authoritative, humanistic as well as scientific. So Science shouldn't be seen as something that belongs only to the elites. It should be something for everybody. And everybody has their own specific knowledge and understanding, which has a right to be shared. But within this process of sharing information, it's not just about communicating the facts. So when we're talking to people, yes, they need to understand the process of science. Yes, they need to understand how to identify good information from bad. But we also need to recognize that we're speaking to people. We're speaking to emotions and to biases and to sometimes very real and genuine fears. And so we need to remember that there is a human involved in all of this. And we need to make that human as central to our communication as we do the information. So no matter where we are in the world, and no matter the cultural differences between media and science, or even between different scientists and researchers, there are different ways that we can span these differences. Now, the science and technology that we have now are new, and they will continue to evolve, probably very rapidly. But the challenges we face in communicating these new scientific and technological ideas to society are not. They have existed and will continue to persist for hundreds of years. Just as scientific knowledge is incremental and replicable, we can approach communication practice in the same way. We have a vast history of understanding and examining how knowledge has been passed from generation to generation, the traditional ways in which we shared knowledge within and between groups. And we know what worked in the past and we know what didn't work. So just as we will repeat experiments to make sure that the method is consistent and getting us the results that we want, we should approach our communication in the same way, informed by what has been done before. Finally, the pursuit of knowledge and its communication is a human endeavour. So no matter what we're talking about or to who, it is our responsibility to make sure that the needs of our audience and their desire to understand or not is held as a core idea in how we approach our science communication. It's very easy to get lost in the technological side of things and to want to communicate the information and to educate. But first we need to connect with people. And once we create that connection, then we can cross any boundary. Thank you.